I stood in front of the carved mahogany doors of the Waldorf Astoria, my hand resting carefully over my chest, right over the inside pocket where I had hidden my late wife's pearl necklace. I had waited years for this night, the night I would fasten those pearls around my granddaughter Clara's neck myself, moments before she walked down the aisle. And then, right at the threshold of that glittering ballroom, my own son stepped out and blocked the doorway with his body. He looked me dead in the eye. His voice dropped to something low, cold, almost gentle in how cruel it was. "You're not on the list, Dad. You don't belong here. Go home before you embarrass yourself and ruin everything." Behind the glass, hundreds of Silicon Valley's most powerful people stared at an old man being thrown out by his own blood like a beggar at the door. And in that exact moment of humiliation, the thick fog that had clouded my mind for 3 straight months, the fog my son and daughter-in-law kept calling early dementia, vanished completely. A cold, sharp clarity ran down my spine. I was not sick. There was no decline. My own son had been slipping sedatives into my blood pressure medication every single morning for months. They wanted to hollow out my mind and turn me into a helpless old fool so they could take everything I had built. Standing in front of the man planning to bury me alive, I did not scream. I did not beg to see my granddaughter. 41 years in business do not allow a man the luxury of falling apart in public. I simply smiled, the coldest smile I'd worn in 72 years of living, and said quietly, "It's fine, son." I turned and walked out into the freezing night, sat down in the back seat of my Lincoln, and called my attorney. My son believed he had just locked an old wolf in a cage. He had no idea that in 72 hours he would be on his knees in front of me, sobbing, watching his entire empire of lies collapse into ash. Before I go on, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to stand up for your own dignity against family who underestimated exactly what you were capable of, hit like and subscribe. This story is for you. My name is Arthur Sterling. I am 72 years old. I once believed that building $1 billion technology empire and shielding my children from every hardship in life was the purest form of love a father could give. I was wrong. I did not raise a family. I unknowingly fattened a pack of predators. This is the full story of how blood turned to betrayal, and how I had to become someone far colder than I ever wanted to be, to protect everything I still held sacred. For 41 years, I built something out of nothing. Sterling Tech began in a 2-car garage in Sunnyvale, back when a firewall was still a new idea and nobody believed a stubborn engineer from a dead-end town in Ohio could outcode the giants. I built cybersecurity infrastructure that now protects hospitals, power grids, and half the Fortune 500. I did it with my hands, my sleep, and more than anything, with Eleanor beside me. Eleanor died 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. I still make 2 cups of coffee some mornings before I remember there is only one of me now. Grief, I have learned, does not announce itself. It simply moves into the house and starts rearranging the furniture of your mind, and you spend your days walking into walls that used to be doors. She used to say I built Sterling Tech the way other men build cathedrals, one stubborn brick at a time, convinced that if the foundation was strong enough, nothing could ever bring the whole structure down. I believed her, and I believed it about our family too. I thought love, like good architecture, simply held once you'd built it correctly. I did not understand back then that a foundation only protects you from forces outside the walls. It does nothing at all to protect you from the people you've already let inside. I tell you this because grief is the door my family walked through. But to understand exactly how they walked through it, I need to take you back 3 months, before the ballroom, before the pearls, before I understood what was happening to my own mind. For the last 3 months I had been living inside something I can only describe as fog. Not sadness, fog. My thoughts would start clear, and then dissolve halfway through a sentence, like fine print left out in the rain. I forgot where I put my car keys. I forgot the name of my own accountant for a full, humiliating minute during a call. I attributed it to age, to loss, to the slow erosion that happens to a man once life takes away the person who kept him sharp. My son, Harrison, and his wife, Victoria, had a different explanation, and they were remarkably patient in delivering it. They visited more often than they had in years. They brought soup. They sat with me on the porch of the Palo Alto house Eleanor and I had built our whole life inside of, and they told me gently that my granddaughter Clara, the light of my life since the day she was born, had asked for something small for her wedding. A backyard ceremony, 20 guests, no stress, no spectacle, nothing that would tax an old man's fragile heart. "She's worried about you, Dad," Harrison told me, squeezing my hand. "She doesn't want you exhausted walking her down the aisle in some 300-person circus. She wants it quiet, intimate, just family." I believed him. God help me, I believed him because believing him meant I got to picture my granddaughter married in the garden where she used to catch fireflies as a little girl, and because doubting him would have meant doubting the last people I had left. It was Thomas who saved my mind before anyone tried to save or steal anything else. Thomas Reyes had been my driver for 30 years. He drove Eleanor to chemo. He drove Clara to her first day of college. He is, in every way that matters, family, though he would never presume to say so himself. 3 weeks ago, while refilling my weekly pill organizer, as he sometimes did when my hands ached with arthritis, Thomas noticed something wrong. The blood pressure tablets in the bottle did not match the ones from my last refill. Same bottle, same label, different pill. Smaller, a slightly different shade of white. Thomas did not confront anyone. He is too careful a man for that. Instead, he quietly photographed the pills, drove to an independent pharmacist 2 towns over, a woman who owed him a favor from years back, and asked her to identify them off the record. They were a low-dose sedative, the kind prescribed for anxiety, taken in careful, monitored amounts. I had been swallowing one every morning with my orange juice for 3 months, believing it was medicine for my heart, when it was quietly, deliberately clouding my mind. Thomas switched the pills for vitamins that matched the size and color as closely as he could, and he watched me like a hawk for the next several days without telling me why. On the 3rd day, I woke up and the fog had lifted so completely that it frightened me. I remembered every digit of a phone number I hadn't dialed in a year. I read the newspaper front to back without losing the thread. I stood in my own kitchen and for the first time in 3 months correctly recalled the name of the young engineer I'd hired to lead our threat detection division, a name that had been slipping away from me like water through cupped hands for weeks. I felt for the first time in 3 months entirely like myself. It is a strange and specific horror, realizing your own mind has been stolen from you gradually enough that you mistook the theft for grief. I did not feel angry that first clear morning. I felt afraid. Afraid in the particular way a man feels when he understands he has been navigating blind for months and has no idea what he might have agreed to, signed, or given away while the fog was thickest. That was the day the florist called. It was an honest mistake. A scheduling assistant at a luxury event florist in San Francisco, cross-referencing a client list, dialed my number instead of my son's. She was cheerful, professional, entirely unaware she was handing me the first thread of a rope that would eventually hang a very expensive lie. "Mr. Sterling, I just wanted to confirm the final floral installation for Saturday evening. The arrangement for the Waldorf ballroom came to just under $60,000, and we have that billed to Vanguard Capital as requested. Should I send the final invoice to you directly or to Mr. Harrison Sterling's office?" I did not correct her right away. I sat very still, the phone warm against my ear, and felt something in my chest go cold and clear, the way still water does, the instant before it freezes. $60,000. The Waldorf Astoria. Vanguard Capital. Not a backyard. Not 20 guests. Not quiet. and not intimate, and certainly not something arranged to spare an old man's fragile heart. I hung up, and for a long moment I simply sat in Eleanor's reading chair by the window, running my thumb along the worn velvet arm the way she used to when she was thinking through a problem. Then I went to my closet and took out the navy tuxedo I had worn to our 40th anniversary, the one Eleanor always said made me look like the man she fell in love with instead of the man who forgot to shave. From her jewelry box I took the pearl necklace she had worn on our own wedding day, the one I had promised Clara she would wear on hers, and slipped it into my breast pocket, close to my heart, exactly where I intended to keep it, until the moment I could fasten it around my granddaughter's neck myself. I did not call ahead. I did not confront Harrison on the phone. 41 years of building an empire teaches you one lesson above all others. Never announce your move before you understand the board. This is the moment I told you about at the beginning. The Waldorf's ballroom entrance that evening was a wall of warm light and low music, orchids stacked in white cascades along the corridor, the murmur of a few hundred well-dressed strangers drifting out from behind heavy double doors. I recognized faces from the tech world, from boards I used to sit on, from a life I had built brick by brick. And standing directly in front of those doors, immaculate in a tailcoat, was my son. For one foolish second my heart lifted. I thought he was waiting there to walk me in. Then I saw his face. "Dad," Harrison said, his voice pitched low, urgent, his eyes darting past my shoulder to see who might be watching. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here for my granddaughter's wedding, Harrison." "What exactly do you think I'm doing here?" His jaw worked. He glanced back toward the doors, then at me, and something in his expression hardened into a mask I did not recognize on my own son's face. "You're not on the list, Dad. There's been a mix-up. Please, just go home before you make a scene." I looked past him, through the gap in the doors, at the chandeliers and the champagne towers and the size of a crowd that no small, anxious bride would ever have asked for. I looked at my son, who had told me, with a straight face and a gentle hand on my shoulder, that this was going to be 20 people in a backyard. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an explanation in front of 300 strangers, though God knows I wanted to. I have negotiated hostile takeovers and survived congressional hearings. I know precisely what it costs a man to lose his composure in public, and I was not going to hand my son that satisfaction. "It's fine, son," I said, and I meant it to sound calm, though something in my chest was breaking quietly, privately, the way a foundation cracks long before the house falls. I turned and walked back through the golden lobby, past the doorman, out into the cool San Francisco night, and got into the back seat of my car, where Thomas was waiting exactly where he always was. "Mr. Sterling," he said carefully, watching me in the mirror, "are you all right?" I looked down at my hands, steady now for the first time in 3 months, and I understood with total clarity that the fog in my mind had not been age, and it had not been grief. It had been engineered. "Thomas," I said quietly, "take me to Benjamin's office, and call him. Tell him the winter protocol starts tonight." Benjamin Hayes had been my personal attorney for over 20 years, and in all that time I had triggered the winter protocol exactly once before, during a hostile takeover attempt in 2009 that nearly cost me the entire company. He knew what those 3 words meant. Freeze everything. Trust accounts, corporate credit lines, shared signatory access. Sever it all before the enemy can move another dollar. He met me at his office at 9 that night in jeans and a rumpled sweater, looking like a man who had been called out of a quiet Saturday and understood, from the tone of my voice on the phone, that quiet was over. I told him everything. The florist's call, the Waldorf, Harrison's face at the door. Benjamin listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, and when I finished he was already pulling up encrypted files on his laptop. "Arthur," he said slowly, "I need you to think back 6 months. When Harrison came to you about the emergency power of attorney, the one for the supposed IRS audit, on the family trust. Did you ever actually see the audit notice? Did you see a letter, a case number, anything with an actual federal seal on it? I sat with that question longer than I wanted to. The truth, once I let myself look at it, was humiliating in its simplicity. Harrison had come to me in a state of manufactured panic, papers in hand, telling me the trust was about to be frozen, pending a federal investigation, that we needed to move assets into a temporary protective structure immediately, that there was no time to loop in outside counsel because the deadline was measured in hours, not days. I had signed because my son looked genuinely terrified, and because 6 months ago I still believed terror was something my son was capable of feeling on my behalf rather than something he had learned to perform. I remember the exact weight of the pen in my hand that afternoon. I remember Harrison's knee bouncing under the kitchen table, his voice cracking at what I now understand was a rehearsed moment, and I remember thinking, with a father's foolish pride, that at least the boy still cared enough about something to fall apart in front of me. I had spent so many years worried that grief and distance had hollowed him out. It never once occurred to me that what I mistook for feeling was simply very good acting. No, I admitted, I never saw a notice. Benjamin's mouth tightened. Because there wasn't one. I just pulled the IRS correspondence log tied to the trust's EIN. Nothing. No audit, no inquiry, not so much as a form letter in 6 years. He turned his screen toward me. What I do see is a series of transfers totaling $1.2 million routed through a holding entity called Meridian Bridge LLC, formed 4 days before Harrison came to your house with that story. I stared at the number. It did not shock me the way it should have. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I had already known. That's not even the real problem, Arthur. Benjamin pulled up another window, a corporate filing, and turned the screen toward me again. This is a term sheet. It's dated 11 days ago. Vanguard Capital is structuring what they're calling an emergency leveraged liquidity event for Sterling Tech, a buyout, Arthur, valued at $500 million, and the party listed as authorized signatory, acting on your behalf under the power of attorney you signed 6 months ago, is Harrison. The room seemed to tilt very slightly, the way a ship does before you consciously register the wave beneath it. $500 million. My company. My life's work. The thing Eleanor and I had built from a garage with 2 mortgaged houses and a stubborn refusal to fail, sold out from under me by my own son using a document I had signed while grieving and half-poisoned. There's more, Benjamin said, and something in his voice made me brace myself the way you brace for a blow you already know is coming. I pulled a filing from the county probate registry this afternoon, cross-referenced against a physician's name Harrison has used for insurance billing before. Arthur, there's a petition, an involuntary psychiatric hold, a 72-hour emergency commitment order, medically justified on the grounds of, and I'm quoting the filing, acute cognitive decline consistent with early onset dementia, posing risk to self and financial welfare. I did not speak. I could not for a moment make my mouth form words. It's scheduled to be executed Tuesday morning, Benjamin continued quietly. An ambulance arrives at your house at 7 a.m. You're held for evaluation. And Monday, tomorrow, at 9 a.m. Harrison signs the Vanguard sale as your authorized proxy before the hold even takes effect. So there's no messy overlap for anyone to question later. By the time you're released from a 72-hour hold, Arthur, the money is gone, the company is gone, and your son and daughter-in-law have 2 first-class tickets to a country with no extradition treaty. I sat in that leather chair in Benjamin's office, 72 years old, and felt something inside me that I want to describe honestly, because I think it matters. It was not simply anger. Anger is loud and it burns itself out. What I felt was colder than that, and steadier. It was the particular terrible clarity of a man who has just understood, completely and finally, that the people who were supposed to guard the door had been the ones picking the lock the whole time. "How long do we have?" I asked, and my voice came out steady, which surprised me. Benjamin checked his watch. 36 hours until the ambulance, 35 until the signature. I thought of Eleanor, of the 40th anniversary photo on my nightstand, where we're both laughing at something neither of us remembers now, of the garage in Sunnyvale, where I once worked 18-hour days, convinced that if I just built something good enough, it would protect the people I loved forever. It had not occurred to me back then that I would one day need to protect it from them. "There's a piece of this I still don't fully understand," I told Benjamin, turning the whiskey glass slowly in my hand without drinking from it. "Even if the psychiatric hold succeeds, even if Harrison signs the sale, none of that survives contact with a competent probate court eventually. Eventually someone reviews the medical record. Eventually someone asks why a healthy 72-year-old man was suddenly diagnosed with cognitive decline the same month a $500 million sale needed his signature waived." Benjamin nodded slowly, and I could see him choosing his next words with the particular care of a man about to say something he wished weren't true. "Eventually, yes, but by then Arthur, Harrison, and Victoria are somewhere with no extradition treaty, and the money's moved through enough shell structures that even a favorable ruling might only recover a fraction of it. They're not building something that has to survive forever. They're building something that only has to survive long enough for them to disappear. That's the entire strategy. Speed over permanence." 36 hours, I repeated. "Then we don't sleep tonight, Benjamin. We work." He nodded once and pulled a legal pad toward himself, and for the first time since I'd walked out of that ballroom, I felt something other than grief settle over me. It was purpose. It was the particular, focused calm I used to feel before a difficult negotiation, when the fear finally burns away and all that's left is the work of winning. "There's one more thing," Benjamin said more gently now, and I could see he was choosing his words with unusual care. "I need you to understand something before we go any further tonight, because I don't think you've let yourself think about it yet. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a single bad decision your son made under pressure. The shell company, the forged audit story, the sedatives Thomas found in your pills, the psychiatric filing. Arthur, this took months of planning. Someone sat down and built this the way you'd build a hostile takeover. Deliberately, patiently, and they used your grief to do it, because they knew grief would make you trusting instead of suspicious." I looked down at my own hands, steady now, and thought about the last 3 months. The soup on the porch, the gentle hand on my shoulder, the soft, patient voice telling me to rest, not to worry. That Clara only wanted something small and quiet. I thought about how completely I had let myself be managed, and how much of that management had worn the face of love. "Then we don't just stop the sale," I said quietly. "We make sure this never happens to anyone else who trusted the wrong people with their fog." Benjamin almost smiled. "That's the Arthur Sterling I remember. Now, tell me everything you know about how this company is actually structured, because I think you're about to remind Harrison of something he never bothered to learn." I looked out the window at the city lights, at the particular indifferent beauty San Francisco has at 3 a.m, and thought about how strange it was that the same clear-headedness I had spent 4 decades using to outmaneuver competitors, regulators, and hostile boards was now the only thing standing between me and my own son's ambition. I had built armor for every kind of war except this one. It was time to find out whether the armor still fit. There is a piece of Sterling Tech's history that only 3 people alive know in full detail: myself, Eleanor, who carried the secret to her final days, and Benjamin, who drafted the paperwork 20 years ago and has kept it locked away ever since like a doomsday key he hoped he'd never need to turn. In 2004, after watching 2 colleagues lose their companies to hostile buyouts that gutted the actual innovation and left founders holding empty shells, I made a decision that felt almost paranoid at the time. I split Sterling Tech's core intellectual property, every proprietary encryption algorithm, every threat detection architecture, every patent that made our security systems worth anything at all, out of the parent company entirely. I placed it into a separate, quietly held entity called Aegis Core, structured so that no acquisition of Sterling Tech's corporate shell could ever touch the actual technology without my personal biometric signature. Eleanor thought I was being overly cautious. "You built something people love, Arthur," she told me once. "Why do you assume someone's going to try to take it from you?" I did not have a good answer for her then. I have one now, because I have spent my whole life watching what greed does to people who believe they deserve things they never built. Harrison did not know Aegis Core existed. Why would he? He grew up wealthy, comfortable, insulated from every hard year that built the foundation beneath him. He saw servers, buildings, a logo, a market valuation, the visible architecture of a company. He never once asked what actually made it valuable. He assumed the way people who have never built anything from nothing always assume that a company's worth lives in its furniture rather than in the thing only its founder can carry out the door. I remember the year I built it. Harrison was 17, more interested in a used BMW than in anything happening inside my company, and Eleanor and I sat at this same kitchen table, now sitting empty in Palo Alto, going over the structure line by line with Benjamin until well past midnight, 3 separate nights in a row. "You're building a lifeboat for a ship that hasn't sunk yet," Eleanor told me once, not unkindly, more curious than skeptical. I told her every ship that's ever sunk looked unsinkable the day before it happened. I did not know, back then, that the iceberg I was building a lifeboat against would one day share my last name. At 2 a.m, sitting across from Benjamin in his office, with the city lights blurring through the window behind him, we began quietly, methodically, legally extracting every piece of that intellectual property from Sterling Tech's operating structure and consolidating it under my sole, exclusive authority. By the time Vanguard's lawyers reviewed the sale documents Monday morning, the company Harrison was so proudly signing away would be, in every meaningful sense, an empty shell. Buildings, payroll, nothing that actually worked. But a hollow victory was not enough for me. I did not simply want to stop the theft. I needed to understand exactly what my son had become, and I needed proof strong enough that no court, no investor, and no part of my own aching heart could ever again talk me into believing this was a misunderstanding. That's when Benjamin told me about Marcus. Marcus Webb was a private investigator Benjamin had used for corporate due diligence for over a decade. Quiet, meticulous, discreet, in the way only former federal agents learn to be. 2 days earlier, before I even knew what I was walking into, Benjamin had grown suspicious enough about the sudden surge of unusual account activity to quietly deploy Marcus to the Waldorf event as event staff. A waiter, invisible in a room full of powerful people who never looked twice at the person refilling their glass. Marcus had planted a small recording device beneath the table in the private lounge reserved for Harrison and the senior partners from Vanguard Capital. "Marcus called it in 20 minutes after the lounge cleared out," Benjamin told me, sliding the drive across the desk with 2 fingers, the way you'd hand someone something you weren't entirely sure they should touch. He said he almost dropped his serving tray twice. Said in 15 years of this work, he's rarely heard people that comfortable being that ugly with a microphone 18 inches from their elbows. That kind of comfort only comes from believing, completely, that you'll never be caught. Benjamin placed the small flash drive on the desk between us sometime after 3 a.m, and I understood, looking at it, that I was about to hear something that would end whatever fragment of my relationship with my son still existed. I poured myself 2 fingers of the whiskey Benjamin kept in his bottom drawer for exactly these kinds of nights, and I pressed play. The audio was clean, crystal glasses, the low murmur of a private room, the particular relaxed cadence of men who believe they have already won. I heard Harrison's voice, warm and confident, in a way I hadn't heard from him in years, thanking the Vanguard partners for their patience. I heard him explain with a casualness that turned my stomach that the old man's cognitive situation had been carefully managed for months, and that by Tuesday there would be no legal friction whatsoever once the commitment order took effect. I gripped the arm of my chair and kept listening. What I had not expected, what none of Benjamin's research had prepared me for, was a second voice, younger, precise, analytical in a way that had nothing to do with love or family and everything to do with strategy. This voice walked the room through the exact mechanics of how a psychiatric hold, timed correctly, would eliminate any future legal challenge to the sale, how the power of attorney's language could be interpreted to survive scrutiny, how the offshore accounts should be structured to minimize the paper trail. It took me a moment to place the voice, because I'd only ever heard it soft and adoring, whispering vows at a wedding I had been locked out of. It was Julian, my granddaughter's husband, the young man Clara had introduced to me 8 months ago, with stars in her eyes, telling me he worked in finance, that he was kind, that he made her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed since her own father's slow drift into distance began years before I ever understood why. I had shaken his hand. I had, God forgive me, been glad for her. Julian was not a groom who happened to work at Vanguard Capital. Julian was a junior analyst at Vanguard Capital who had been assigned, deliberately, strategically, to court my granddaughter, marry into the Sterling family, and provide the internal access and family cover that made the entire acquisition possible from the inside. Clara had not fallen in love. Clara had been targeted the same way Sterling Tech had been targeted, the same way I had been targeted by people who had learned that the fastest way into a fortress is through the people who love its owner. Benjamin, listening beside me with his own face grown pale, pulled up Julian's professional history within minutes. A resume thin on genuine credentials, but rich in the kind of vague, unverifiable, strategic advisory work that firms like Vanguard use to disguise exactly this sort of assignment. Julian had joined the firm 14 months earlier. He had been introduced to Clara at a technology conference 8 months ago, at an event, we would later confirm, that Vanguard's business development team had specifically encouraged him to attend. Nothing about their meeting had been left to chance. Even the coincidence of shared interests Clara had marveled over. His supposed love of the same obscure jazz trio she'd followed since college turned out, when Benjamin dug further, to have been researched from her own public social media accounts weeks before they ever spoke. I sat very still after the recording ended, the whiskey untouched, and felt a grief so total it briefly eclipsed even the anger. Because as devastating as it was to learn what Harrison and Victoria had done to me, it was almost unbearable to understand what they had allowed, perhaps even orchestrated, to be done to Clara. My granddaughter had not simply been kept in the dark. She had been handed to a stranger as currency. "Arthur," Benjamin said quietly, watching my face, "there's a decision in front of you now that matters more than the money or the company. Clara doesn't know any of this yet. And when she finds out, and she has to find out because she's about to marry the man who helped plan her own family's destruction, it's going to break something in her that may never fully heal." I thought of Clara at 6 years old, catching fireflies in the garden, while Eleanor and I watched from the porch. I thought of her at 22, calling me sobbing with joy after her first business pitch succeeded. I thought of everything I had ever wanted to protect her from, and understood, with the particular ache only a grandfather can feel, that I could not protect her from this. I could only make sure she did not face it alone. "Get me her number changed to a burner line Harrison can't trace," I said. "I need to see her tomorrow morning, alone, before either of us loses the chance to choose what happens next." Clara agreed to meet me at 7 the next morning at the Botanical Garden in Golden Gate Park, The same quiet corner near the Japanese tea garden where Eleanor used to bring her every spring when she was small, back when a 5-year-old's biggest worry was whether the koi would come to the surface for breadcrumbs. I had chosen the place deliberately. There is a particular kind of conversation that cannot happen in a living room or an office, where the walls remember only ordinary days. I needed somewhere that already held enough love in its soil to absorb what I was about to say, without either of us drowning in it. I arrived early and sat on the bench we always used, watching the mist lift slowly off the pond, rehearsing words that I knew, even as I rehearsed them, would never be gentle enough for what I was about to say. Clara walked toward me, with her coat pulled tight against the morning chill, and the moment she saw my face, something in her own expression faltered. She had been crying. I could see it in the redness around her eyes, and for one terrible second, I thought perhaps she already knew. She did not. She thought I had suffered a stroke. "Grandpa," she said, her voice breaking as she half ran the last few steps toward me. "They told me. Mom said you had a stroke, that you couldn't walk, that you were too ashamed to come to the wedding because you didn't want me to see you like that. I wanted to come to you. I wanted to see you, and they kept saying it was too much, that you needed rest, that seeing me cry would only make it worse for your heart." She was in my arms before she finished the sentence, and I held my granddaughter the way I had held her the day she was born, feeling the same fierce, helpless love, except now that love had teeth in it, because I finally understood exactly what it needed to protect her from. "Clara," I said when her sobbing had quieted enough for words to reach her, "I did not have a stroke. I have never been healthier in my life. I need you to sit down, and I need you to let me tell you something that is going to be very hard to hear, and I need you to trust me enough to hear all of it before you decide what to feel." I told her about the pills Thomas had found. I told her about the florist's call, the Waldorf, the moment Harrison told me I wasn't on the list. I told her about the shell company, the forged power of attorney, the involuntary commitment order scheduled for Tuesday morning, the $500 million sale scheduled for the very next day. I watched each piece land on her like a physical blow, watched the disbelief in her eyes slowly curdle into something closer to horror as the pieces began unwillingly to fit. And then I told her about the recording. I did not want to play it for her. Some part of me, the part that had held her as a baby, that had walked her down the very aisle she was married on 3 days before, that had wanted more than anything to shield her from every hard thing this world could offer, wanted to spare her this specific pain. But I had learned over 4 decades of hard decisions that protecting someone from the truth is not the same thing as protecting them from harm. Sometimes it is simply delaying the harm and making it larger. I played the recording on my phone, there on the bench by the pond, with the mist still lifting off the water and a heron standing perfectly still at the far edge, as if even the birds understood something sacred was breaking. I watched my granddaughter's face as she heard her new husband's voice, calm, precise, utterly without love, describing the mechanics of dismantling her own family's fortune and her own grandfather's freedom. I watched 26 years of trust collapse in real time, watched her hand fly to her mouth, watched the particular silence that only comes after a person's entire understanding of their own life has been quietly, completely rewritten. She did not speak for a long time after the recording ended. She simply sat very still, staring at the water. And I did not fill the silence, because I understood that some silences are not meant to be filled. They are meant to be survived. "He proposed to me at the aquarium," she finally said, her voice hollow and strange. "He said he'd been planning it for months. He knew exactly which exhibit I'd love most. He knew everything about me, Grandpa. Every detail. I thought that meant he paid attention because he loved me." She let out a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "He paid attention because he was studying me, like a target." "You are not foolish for trusting him, Clara," I said, and I made sure she heard every word. You were deceived by professionals who spent months building a version of themselves specifically designed to be trusted by someone as good and open-hearted as you are. That is not a failure of your judgment. That is a testament to how carefully they planned this. I thought, as I said it, of my own 3 fogged months, of how easily even a man who had spent 40 years learning to spot deception in boardrooms had been managed by people who understood exactly which levers grief leaves exposed. If it could happen to me, hardened by decades of exactly this kind of warfare, I did not see how anyone could reasonably expect a 26-year-old in love to have seen it coming. And my parents let it happen. Her voice cracked on the word parents. They let him marry me. They used my wedding. Oh, no. I did not soften that truth for her because she deserved the dignity of facing it clearly, the way I had chosen to face it myself. Your parents did more than let it happen, sweetheart. I believe they built the door he walked through. She wept again then, but it was a different kind of weeping than when she'd arrived. Not the confused grief of someone mourning a grandfather she thought she'd lost, but the deep, wrenching grief of someone burying an entire version of her own life. I let her cry as long as she needed, my arm around her shoulders, the same way I had once let Eleanor cry after every hard year of building this company, understanding that grief, properly honored, eventually clears space for something sturdier to grow. When she finally lifted her head, something in her had changed. I recognized it, because I had felt the same shift in myself 2 nights earlier, standing outside those carved mahogany doors with my late wife's pearls hidden against my chest. It was the moment grief stops being only sorrow and starts becoming resolve. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, and her voice, though still raw, had steadied into something I recognized instantly. It was Eleanor's voice, the one she used when a decision had been made and there was no longer any use in dwelling on how we'd arrived at needing to make it. "I need you to understand that nothing that happens next will be about revenge," I told her. "I have built and lost enough in this life to know that revenge burns down the person carrying the torch, as surely as it burns the target. What I need from you is truth and courage and the willingness to walk into a room tomorrow and stand beside the people who are actually your family." Clara reached up and unclasped the wedding ring from her finger, a ring, I would later learn, purchased with money quietly diverted from the very trust Harrison had drained under false pretenses, and held it for a long moment in her open palm, watching the morning light catch its edges. Then she threw it into the pond, watched it disappear beneath the surface without a single ripple of hesitation, and turned to me with red eyes and a steady jaw that was unmistakably, entirely a sterling. "Tell me what time the meeting is tomorrow," she said. "I want to be there when they realize what they lost." Monday morning arrived gray and quiet over the city, the kind of morning that gives no indication of the storm about to move through a glass conference room on the 40th floor of Vanguard Capital's downtown headquarters. Harrison, Victoria, and Julian were already seated when Clara and I arrived, flanking 3 senior partners from Vanguard along a long mahogany table stacked with copies of a $500 million acquisition agreement, expensive pens laid out with the ceremonial precision of men who believed the outcome of this meeting had already been decided. I had spent the morning with Benjamin reviewing every legal contingency we could think of, but in the end, the plan we settled on required something other than legal argument. It required my son to believe one final time that he had won. I walked in slowly. I let my shoulders drop. I let my eyes go soft and distant, the way they had, unknowingly, for 3 drugged months. I reached out and gripped the back of a chair as though I needed it to stay standing, and I said in a voice pitched to sound thin and lost, "Eleanor? Eleanor, is that you? Did we already do the toast?" I watched the color drain from Harrison's face, watched Victoria's hand fly to her mouth in what I am certain, even now, was not concern but calculation. The calculation of a woman realizing her carefully built story had just been handed unexpected confirmation in front of the exact people who needed to believe it. I let myself sway slightly, and I pressed the folded power of attorney document into the hand of the lead Vanguard partner, murmuring something about needing my son to handle things because my head felt so foggy today. For one suspended moment the room held its breath, and I understood that everyone in it believed they were watching the final, tragic confirmation of a story that had been carefully constructed for months. Then the lead partner, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Foster, who had built her career on due diligence, rigorous enough to survive federal scrutiny, did precisely what a seasoned investor does when the ground beneath a $500 million deal suddenly shifts. She stopped moving toward her pen. "Harrison," she said slowly, her eyes moving between me and the document in her hand. "You told us 3 weeks ago on record, in a signed representation letter to our compliance department, that your father was fully competent and that this transaction had his complete, informed knowledge and consent. You specifically assured us there was no cognitive impairment that could later be used to challenge the validity of this sale." Her voice sharpened. "If what I'm watching right now is real, we are about to sign a $500 million agreement based on the authority of a power of attorney executed by a man who cannot recognize his own son. That's not a legal gray area, Harrison. That's fraud. That's the kind of fraud that puts people like me in a room with the SEC and people like you in federal prison." Harrison's mouth opened and closed, and I watched with something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief, the precise moment my son understood he had built a trap so effective it had finally closed on himself. "He's fine," Harrison said, too quickly, too loudly. "He's just tired. Dad, tell them you're fine." For one strange moment I stood there in the space between two versions of myself. The frightened, fogged man I had performed for this room and the man I actually was underneath it, who had watched all morning as his own son sat comfortable and certain at the head of a table built from stolen years. Some part of me, old and tired and still grieving Eleanor more than I let anyone see, wanted very badly for the performance to be unnecessary. I wanted, even now, for there to be some explanation that made my son something other than what the recording had proven him to be. There was not. There never had been. I straightened. I let 72 years of building an empire settle back into my spine, let the fog I had performed for exactly as long as I needed it dissolve from my eyes, and I looked at my son with a clarity that I watched land on him like a physical blow. "I'm entirely fine, Harrison," I said, my voice steady and cold, and carrying easily to every corner of that glass room. "I have been fine for the last 3 days. Ever since a man who has driven me for 30 years noticed you'd swapped my medication for sedatives. I have been fine long enough to learn about Meridian Bridge LLC, long enough to review the psychiatric commitment order you filed for Tuesday morning. Long enough," I added, turning my gaze toward Julian, who had gone very still, "to hear a recording of a private conversation at the Waldorf Astoria 3 nights ago, discussing exactly how you plan to use that commitment order to protect this sale from legal challenge." The silence that followed was the particular, total silence of a room full of powerful people realizing all at once precisely how much danger they are standing in. "I don't know what you're talking about," Julian said, but his voice had lost every trace of the warmth I remembered from our first handshake 8 months ago. "You told my granddaughter you loved the way she talked with her hands," I said quietly, watching him. "You told her that at the aquarium the night you proposed. I know because she told me that story with such joy I nearly cried. I wonder how long you rehearsed that line before you used it." Julian said nothing. There are, I have found, certain silences that answer questions more completely than words ever could. Clara stepped forward, and I watched her do something I will remember for the rest of my life. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply reached into her coat pocket, withdrew her phone, and set it on the table, the recording already cued. "Play it," she said to Diane Foster, not to her husband. "Play the part where he explains the offshore account structure. I think you'll want to hear that before anyone signs anything." Diane Foster did not need to be asked twice. I will not pretend the next 20 minutes were dignified for anyone in that room, except, I hope, for Clara and myself. Diane Foster listened to 11 minutes of recorded audio with a stillness that grew colder with every sentence, and when it ended, she did not look at Harrison or Julian with anger so much as with the particular contemptuous disappointment of a professional who has just discovered she was nearly made complicit in something criminal by people too greedy to consider the risk. She stood, gathered the unsigned acquisition documents into a neat stack, and informed the room, in a voice that had gone entirely flat, that Vanguard Capital would be formally withdrawing from the transaction effective immediately, that internal compliance would be reviewing every document Harrison had submitted over the past 6 months, and that Julian's employment was terminated as of that moment, a termination that would, within the week, be followed by criminal referrals to federal prosecutors for both men. I placed one more document on the table before the meeting fully dissolved into chaos. A summary, prepared by Benjamin overnight, showing that Sterling Tech's core intellectual property had already been legally separated into Aegis Core 2 decades earlier, and that the company Vanguard had spent months courting was, in every functional sense, an empty building with a familiar name on the door. "You were never buying a company," I told the room, quietly now, because I no longer needed to raise my voice for anyone to hear me. "You were buying a shell. Everything that made Sterling Tech worth $500 million left with me 20 years ago, long before any of you sat down at this table." Harrison's composure finally broke entirely. He came around the table, reaching for me, his voice cracking into something younger and more frightened than I had heard from him since he was a boy. "Dad, please. I can fix this. I'll give it all back. Just don't do this, please. I'm your son." I looked at him for a long moment, and I want you to understand that what I felt in that moment was not triumph. It was grief, clean and total, for the boy I had raised who had somehow become a man capable of drugging his own father and offering his daughter as currency to close a deal. But grief, I have learned, does not obligate you to hand someone your future simply because they regret losing it. "You told me I wasn't on the list, Harrison," I said. "This morning you're not on mine." I turned and offered my arm to Clara, who took it without hesitation, and together we walked out of that glass room, leaving behind the wreckage of a plan that had taken months to build and less than an hour to collapse. Victoria was arrested 2 weeks later on charges of financial fraud and conspiracy, following an investigation Benjamin helped initiate with federal prosecutors. Harrison's case is still moving through the courts as I write this, though I am told the evidence, thanks to Marcus's recording and the paper trail Benjamin uncovered, leaves very little room for a favorable outcome. Julian was quietly, permanently blacklisted from an industry that, whatever its flaws, does not forgive being caught defrauding a $500 million acquisition target on tape. Clara filed for annulment within the month and has not spoken to either of her parents since the day in that glass room, though she tells me, on the harder nights, that she still grieves the version of them she thought she knew, and I have told her that grief is not weakness. It is simply love with nowhere left to go. I want to end this story somewhere gentler than a courtroom, because that is not, in the end, what I want you to remember. A few months later, Clara and I sat together on the back porch of the Palo Alto house, the same porch where Harrison once told me, with a gentle hand on my shoulder, that I should rest and not worry about anything. The evening fog was rolling in off the bay the way it does most nights, soft and slow, nothing at all like the fog that had once been slipped into my morning coffee. Clara had moved into the guest room temporarily, though we both suspected, without saying so, that it might become something more permanent than either of us had planned. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked me quietly, watching the fog settle over the garden where she used to catch fireflies. Building Aegis Core, keeping it separate all those years. You spent 2 decades protecting something from a threat you couldn't even name yet. I thought about that for a long time before I answered because it deserved a truthful answer rather than a comfortable one. I don't think you can protect the people you love by refusing to imagine the worst of what might happen to them, I told her. I think you protect them by building strong enough foundations that even the worst when it comes doesn't take everything. I lost a son to greed, Clara. I won't pretend that doesn't break something in me that will never fully mend. But I didn't lose you, and I didn't lose the thing your grandmother and I spent our whole lives building. Some roots, when you look closely enough, turn out to be strong enough to survive even the branches that rot. Clara leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was small, and for a long while neither of us said anything else. The fog moved slowly over the garden, soft and harmless now. Just weather, just an evening settling gently over a house that had finally, after everything, become quiet in the right way. She has started, in the past few weeks, sitting in on Aegis Core's leadership meetings. Not because I asked her to, but because she asked to be there, and because I have watched, with a pride I don't think I've ever felt this completely, the particular way she asks questions no one else in the room thinks to ask. She has Eleanor's patience and my stubbornness, which I suspect is either the best or the most dangerous combination a person can inherit. I have started, quietly, restructuring parts of the company's governance to make sure that whatever I build next cannot be dismantled by anyone who mistakes love for leverage ever again. And Clara, more than anyone, understands exactly why that matters. I am 72 years old. I have built and rebuilt more times than I ever expected to. And if there is one thing I want you to carry away from this story, it is this. Love does not require you to accept every hand held out to you, especially the ones that were only ever reaching for what's in your pockets. Sometimes the deepest act of love, for yourself and for the people who actually deserve your loyalty, is having the courage to look clearly at what has rotted, and the strength to cut it away before it takes the whole tree down with it. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to protect yourself from someone who was supposed to protect you? Tell me your story. And if you believe, as I do, that family is built on trust rather than blood alone, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.